I think for the last 3 years I've been working on some themes related to the failure of the modern architecture and how those utopias change it through time and how those buildings that were made are perceived today and how people relate to them. So either I would create that installation that I made maybe 3 years ago, the installation for the cracking floor. That was exactly that I remade the floor of the gallery with a layer of foam under the cement. So when the exhibition opened, while people go in, the floor would crack. So it's this idea that the utopia itself, it cracks by the use of the people. So it was an experience that would relate to the theme I was interested in talking, but not very straightforward in a more poetic or even fun and ironic way. And together with that installation, I started making the sculptures of the Abismos series that are the ones that are here in the show. And they are usually 2 pieces of cement that have their balance kept by an amount of paper. So it's this relation of the fragility of the paper, but also at the same time it's this fragile element that keeps the assembled together in the position. So what relates me to the architecture is that the living part of the building is what really makes it happen and what really makes it in balance, because if it's empty, it makes no sense. So it's this fragile and delicate relation of the living and the construction. So that's what brought me to make this. And in the last show I made in São Paulo 2 months ago, I presented a body of work and a big installation. So the installation, I called it Resaca, which I think in Spanish is the same, but in English it could be either hungover, which is the feeling after you really get drunk, and undertow, that is the movement of sea when there is a storm that brings things to the shore. So in that installation, the thing was, I took the length of the plot of the place where the gallery is, which is the only plot in the neighborhood that has no grades closing it. Like, to have grades in Brazil is something very common because of the violence and security, or people get in that mood. So what I did was I built an installation inside the gallery with the measure of the 65 meters long grades that didn't exist outside the gallery, and inside the gallery they were functioning as a tool of recreating the space of the gallery itself. So it was experimenting the space with the walls that were movable, and so taking the grades of the position of being just a barrier, but something that is, you relate with it and then you recreate it in another way. So it was very much about the experience of the space of the gallery at that time. And the other body of work that I showed together was called You Text Nothing Like You Look, and it's a relation for me of poetry and sculpture. So I was also then, after so long working about architecture and this very straightforward theme, I decided to go on a less direct theme. That would be the idea of translation for poetry. Once translation poetry, it's already complicated. I tried to make it even more impossible to translate some verses of poetry into objects. So by the time I started making it, I choose verses from poems in the original language that I could read, either Portuguese, English, Spanish, and Italian. And then I started making sculptures on as a translation for those words. And when I first got the first sculptures made, they actually didn't relate only to that sentence that I choose to translate, but it felt to me that I need to look for another title. So the object itself gave me another answer about another poem. So in that series of works, they all have two titles, one in one language and the other one in another language, as they would be translation of each other, but they are not. They are just the text that became object and the answer that object bring me as text. So it's this crazy understanding of objects and literature that was really, it's been really interesting because also the works, they started appearing in a very diverse way with very different materials, and so I started to get even more interested in it, kind of escaping the idea of the series of works. Although it's still series of works, it doesn't follow any aesthetics or material-wise parameters. So, and in here, I think that's the 3 works that I'm doing are from this same series that you text nothing like you look, and another one from the White Lies series that is also related to architecture and this history of architecture being made mainly, at least in South America and Occidental world, by white men, not many women architects either. So going back to all those utopias and all those failures, it's also a very only way of seeing the possibility of modernity and not understanding it as a very multiple way, but only one answer for all the problems. So the White Lies are like these columns really made of paper and concrete, as paper being not fragile at all to support the weight of it. So it's this relation of building a building in a not very solid foundation. But it's related to then how to, it's only a very personal way of seeing the materiality and how it feels and how it is translated in object. That is a non-straight conversation actually. But I think the results are being very interesting. Yeah, so in the end, I think I've been working with the cement and concrete in very different situations for 5 or 6 years. And in actually, every time I try to get like a very formal or technical information about the cement, at least in the beginning, at a certain point I just gave up asking. All the information would be very into construction and to another way of thinking. So, and I was more interested about maybe the failure of making the cement or how it would create something not structural. So the whole practice has been lots of very experimental in a way to understand how we would, for example, in the White Lie series, which cement would not stain the paper and how it would not wet the paper completely, and how to use additives on it to make it more easy to either to go into the cast or to dry. So it's funny that in the end, cement that is something very, very easy to find everywhere. It changes a lot every city that I go to work. So every time I get to a new country, at least, you have to understand how the types of cement works and how you will use it, which is very interesting. That also shows that although it's a very simple material made exclusively for construction, it can be molded and it can show in very different ways. So it can give a message of understanding in a very different situation. So that's why in the end I think it interests me a lot. I also come from an architecture background, so right in the beginning of my work I was working a lot with paper, but paper with images, either maps or photographs or books. And I did a few works, well, actually a lot of works with the image, and at a certain point I didn't want to use the image itself anymore, and I wanted to go to a more abstract way of talking of sculpture. So in that decision I also took the decision of not using much materials in the way that they are not show the color original. So usually the paper is white and the cement is gray and the wood is like wood, and so I don't use paint much, not even color. The metals are the metal colors, and in the end it's very raw material that has its own color by nature, and it relates a lot about how in Brazil we learn architecture, or we study an interesting way of how brutalism was made and how it reflects our society, and why to keep this research. So I think in the end many of decisions are related to these studies on architecture. This is like a click that you cannot return. So you keep adding new stuff in the research, but the way of thinking of an architect still works in the same way. So it's all, I think there is this idea of, there are some things that interested me a lot, so it's like a gravity point that the subjects go around, some come and go and disappear, then come back in another way. So it's really, I see my practice in this way. I don't see that I need to keep doing something that I've been doing for a long time. I'm more interested in maybe taking another step and complement what I did with a new idea, not with the same one, because then it created for me a more interesting trajectory for the works.